The citizens of Prague knew the full meaning of occupation by force. The Russians, while supposedly their allies, were not wanted. The fighting spirit of many Czechs was aroused. They retaliated against overwhelming power. But it showed the free world, and Russia too, that their desire to shape their own destiny was stronger even than the heaviest tank or the biggest gun.
This was the scene 3 days ago, when during the night of 20th and 21st of August, Soviet tanks rolled into Czechoslovakia and by morning were in the capital, Prague. Soviet aircraft, pretending to be in trouble, were allowed to land at the airport. They seized it. Units from East Germany, Hungary and Poland have joined the invasion of their ally. Many Czechs came out on the streets to try to persuade the Russian soldiers that they were attacking and crushing their brother communists. Others, particularly students, tried force. Tanks were bombarded with petrol bombs. Yesterday, the Czech Communist Party condemned the invasion. Those who remember 1939, when German tanks and troops took over this country, have coined a slogan. 6 years we waited for your help. 20 years we were friends with you. For 1,000 years, we will hate you. We don't want to live on our knees. When Alexander Dubcek became secretary of the Czech Communist Party in February this year, many hoped the future would be bright. He promised them socialism with a human face. This meant reducing the power of the police and the secret police. It meant allowing people to pass freely across the state frontiers. Criticism of party policy was allowed in the press, even in the national newspaper Rude Pravo, mouthpiece of the Communist Party. And as a British television team, World in Action, found last month,
radio and television too have found a new freedom in the last few months. In the news studio of Czech TV, objective reporting has taken the place of carefully censored party handouts. News bulletins carry messages of support from all over the world. There's a new kind of feeling. They are still careful, but no longer dull.
Socialism with a human face has also meant accepting the right of socialists to form political groups outside the Communist Party, as World in Action found in July.
A remarkable political event took place in Prague. World in Action filmed the first mass meeting of a new political organization called the KAN. We were witnessing the birth of an opposition party in a communist state. KAN's official title is as cumbrous as it is cautious. The club of politically committed persons who are not members of the Communist Party. Already, they have over 40,000 members.
Barriers were taken down. Cultural and economic contacts were formed with the West, especially with West Germany. Attempts were made to calm Russian doubts about all this by stressing that Czechoslovakia remained a socialist state and that the Communist Party would remain in control, and that the defense alliance with Russia and the other Warsaw Pact countries would be kept. Only 2 weeks ago, a meeting at Bratislava between the Czech leaders and the entire Russian Politburo appeared to have gone well, and the feeling was that the Czech plan for reform could go forward. This was the scene when Dubcek returned to Prague and faced the world's press and cameras.
Western and Czech journalists clamored for statements. Dubcek and his team had achieved a kind of success which had set not only their own country but the rest of the world on a firm path to peaceful coexistence. The Russians, through their attitude, had won considerable prestige with the West. Communism, it seemed, was at last unbending. The Cold War had lost a lot of its iciness when just a few hours earlier the Russian leaders had taken leave with warm farewells, smiling, carrying flowers of friendship, and with kisses for their Czech comrades. But so soon did the smiles disappear, the flowers wilt, and the kissed cheeks turn away.
The latest news reaching us suggests that the Czechs have lost out. Alexander Dubcek, party secretary, and Černík, the prime minister, are under arrest. President Svoboda has been flown to Moscow. Civilian resistance is brave, but can't stop tanks. To those who remember the last 20 years, it all seems unhappily familiar. In 1944-45, as Soviet troops flooded westward, they were greeted as liberators, and we in the West cheered on our brave allies. Czechoslovakia, Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria were rescued from Nazi tyranny. Hitler committed suicide as Allied soldiers met in Berlin. The war was over. Everyone could go home. But the Red Army didn't go home. Instead, it helped set up communist governments in all these countries, like Romania, that it had helped liberate. Indeed, Yugoslavia already had a communist government in 1945. Albania and Bulgaria became communist in 1946. Poland, Hungary and Romania in 1947. Czechoslovakia in 1948. And East Germany in 1949. To many it seemed that on the other side of an iron curtain, Nazi tyranny had simply been replaced by Soviet tyranny, as Churchill put it in 1946.
From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line lie all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe.
Stalin, who so recently had been our brave ally against Nazi Germany, now appeared in even greater danger than Hitler had been. Then, in March 1953, Stalin died. And the extreme and harsh policies of Stalin seemed to have died with him, as Lowe, the British cartoonist, showed. There was an early spring clean by Khrushchev, the new Russian leader. With the reins now in his hands, Europe, even Eastern Europe with Russia's satellite states, began to relax. In 1956, Khrushchev publicly criticized some of Stalin's policies. Political prisoners were released. Some had been held since the 1930s. Improvements in living standards were promised. A policy of peaceful coexistence with the West was announced. This was called the Thaw. But in 1953, Russian forces had been in action in East Germany, Poland and Czechoslovakia, where workers demanded more food and freedom. In Poland in June 1956, through a series of strikes, the Poles managed to get the Russians to agree to Polish national communism. There followed a similar demand in Hungary in October 1956, and they even threatened to leave the Warsaw Pact. This time, it led to a Soviet invasion. Pitched battles between Hungarian troops and civilians and Russian tanks began on the 4th of November. This was the Russian view of events.
Hungary was a classical example of armed counter-revolution in action. Its goals and activities were utterly exposed.
In spite of brave resistance, the Hungarians were bloodily defeated, and their leader was shot. Lowe's cartoon shows the way the Western world saw comradeship in Hungary. No honor, no pity, no humanity, nothing but this. And now in unhappy Czechoslovakia, it all seems to be happening again. And once again in 1968, as in 1953 and 1956, the Russians have blamed the West for causing trouble. At 4:30 a.m. last Wednesday, Radio Prague urged listeners, wake up your friends, wake them up right now, early as it is, wake up your neighbors and all other citizens. In a few moments, Czech radio will broadcast an extremely important announcement. The announcement followed. Comrades in the Czech Communist Party asked for military help from the Soviet Union because our country was threatened by counter-revolution and anti-socialist groups who were working with outside forces. Dubcek has been accused of working with Western agents to undermine socialism. The Russians have made a big display of the supply of weapons they say they've found. We can't comment on what the CIA or other intelligence networks may or may not have done, but two questions can be raised. First, why do the Russians fear the West, when the West says that all it wants is to live in peace? In the past, the Russian governments have always feared invasion from the West, as they still do today. After the Bolshevik Revolution, the territorial shield they had built up was lost. After 1945, the chance came for Soviet Russia to rebuild the shield and extend it. Land was annexed along the western frontier. Stalin couldn't risk really free countries along his frontier, so communist governments were set up, forming satellite states, an Eastern Bloc. In the West, all this was watched with horror and alarm. Where would it stop? Were Stalin and communism about to take over the world? In 1946, Churchill warned.
Nobody knows what Soviet Russia and its communist international organization intends to do in the immediate future, or what are the limits, if any, to their expansive and proselytizing tendencies.
President Truman warned Stalin that America would help and defend any country threatened by Russia. In 1949, NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, was formed to defend the West. Would a more moderate policy by either side have had different results? Would it have led, as some believe, to more moderate governments in Eastern Europe? Certainly those governments with their prisons and secret police were harsh, and nowhere harsher than in Czechoslovakia. And this leads to our second question. What's been going on in Czechoslovakia this year to make the Russian leaders act so violently? Has all this suddenly blown up? Or have there been problems since 1948? In 1948, Soviet and communist control over Czechoslovakia was secured by a brutal takeover. Sightseers in Prague still visit the grave of the non-communist leader, Jan Masaryk, who mysteriously fell to his death from a window during the 1948 takeover. A long period of purges and harsh discipline followed. At one stage, the justice minister had to halt all trials because those convicted could not be executed fast enough. At least 124 concentration camps have been identified. All this went along with collectivization of agriculture and the growth of heavy industry. Czechoslovakia seemed to be nothing but a small version of Stalin's Russia. Antonin Novotny, the Czech leader from 1957 until February this year, had continued the harsh system. It seemed that the well-being of the Czechs was being sacrificed to Russian interests. Since Dubcek took over, it's all come out into the open, as World in Action showed last month.
Dr. Otto Schiek is the Deputy Prime Minister and the leading economist in the new government. On television, he has been cataloguing the failures of the old regime. It is an extraordinary indictment, as if a British Chancellor had gone on TV to spell out the faults of his party. He told how the economy had been broken almost beyond repair. He spoke of inadequate housing, incompetent industry, and insufficient services. For the first time in 20 years, the Czech people learnt that life really was better in Western Europe, that the workers of the developed capitalist countries earned much more money than they. Dr. Schick explained that the so-called luxury goods of Czechoslovakia were taken almost for granted in the West, that a Czech worker had to work 5 times longer to earn enough money to buy a tin of coffee or a jar of jam than workers in West Germany, that he had to work 10 times as many hours to buy a transistor radio. He said the standards of housing were among the lowest in Europe, that half had no water and only 1/3 had baths. He pointed out that in the last 10 years there had been 800,000 legal abortions, and the most common reason was lack of accommodation. That there was an 8-year waiting list for houses, and that in Europe only Spain and Portugal built fewer.
But here's the Russian view of Dr. Schick and his broadcast.
In his television appearance, he blackened everything that the Socialist Republic had ever achieved.
The World in Action view was...
The scars of mismanagement are apparent everywhere. Prague has all the minor symptoms of a great city on the verge of collapse. Lifts frequently don't work, the telephone system is erratic, there are mysterious shortages of common food and drink. Even the simplest services, such as taxis or laundries, are difficult to obtain. Everything and everyone seems to be working at half strength.
Pressure was put on Dubcek to slow down the changes. Here's the Russian view.
At the end of July, the Communist Party leaders of Czechoslovakia and the Soviet Union met in Cherna nad Tisa. It was necessitated by the alarming events in Czechoslovakia and in the interests of strengthening socialism in Europe. On August 3rd, the Bratislava Conference of Warsaw Pact countries opened. Bulgaria, Hungary, the German Democratic Republic, Poland, the Soviet Union, and Czechoslovakia were represented. The Bratislava Declaration warned that no one would be allowed to drive a wedge between the socialist countries.
Dubcek stood firm. Even the unexpected military maneuvers in Czechoslovakia by Warsaw Pact troops ended earlier this month, and the troops were withdrawn. The Russians seemed ready to allow Czechoslovakia the sort of freedom granted to Poland in 1956. Why have they decided against this after 6 months and launched an invasion as they did in Hungary? Perhaps it's as the American cartoonist Peb shows, the Russian leaders are tightening their grip in case Czech-style freedom spreads to other parts of the Soviet Empire, even to Russia itself. Some observers suggest that in spite of Dubcek's promises to remain loyal to the Warsaw Pact, the Russians are afraid that, like the Hungarians in 1956, the Czechs will desert and NATO will leap in. Gestures of support from the Yugoslav leader Tito and from the Romanian leader Ceausescu won't have helped Dubcek, for the Russians don't trust them. In February, the Russian leader Brezhnev said, "There is not and cannot be any question now of the leadership of the communist movement from any one center. Every party decides its own political course without assistance and completely independently." Does he still mean this? Are the Czechs to be allowed their own road to socialism? Or will they still have to live on their knees? As we watch our television pictures, listen to Ed Shields' report from Moscow.
The Russian people aren't learning very much about how their boys at the front are doing from Soviet television. Not that TV isn't involved in the Czech situation. It spends hours on the subject every evening. But it'd be hard to tell there were Soviet troops occupying a neighboring nation. Instead, television puts on its most serious-voiced announcers to read the entire text of the wordy Communist Party communications which have already appeared in the newspapers. Then the weighty commentators say the same thing in a slightly different way. Then the cameras go into the factories and industrial organizations and show them mass meetings of workers listening to another version of the explanation of Czechoslovakia. And finally, they raise their hands in approval of the party line. It's all important to the party in justifying its move into Czechoslovakia. But as television news, it's for the history books.